Thanks, Kylie. Thanks to everyone. I'm Chris Gregoire, currently the CEO of Challenge Seattle and the co-chair of the Cascadia Innovation Corridor. On behalf of myself and my colleague, Greg Gavanon from the Business Council of British Columbia, we want to welcome each and every one of you because we've got a tremendous program for you today with some very special experts. This event is being hosted by our Higher Education Research Excellence Committee, which is a part of the Cascadia Corridor. I want to give a thanks to our co-chairs, Gail Murphy, Professor and Vice President of Research and Innovations at the University of British Columbia, Shredik Patel, Professor and Acting Director for the Global Innovation Exchange at the University of Washington, and committee member Jonathan Fink, who's a professor at Portland State University and a visiting professor at the University of British Columbia. Thanks to each of you for hosting today's event. For those of you who are not familiar with the Cascadia Innovation Corridor, it was an initiative identified as one of the 11 mega regions in the United States, one of about 30 worldwide. But this one was identified because of our ties from Portland to Seattle to Vancouver, British Columbia, our cultural ties, our historical ties. And one of the most important ties is our love of the environment, the great outdoors, and our natural resources. It is built on shared values, and we all believe that, yes, we can be better together economically, but we also believe we can be better together at solving some of the most pressing issues in the corridor, sharing those answers worldwide for the betterment of humankind. Wildfires are not new, but in recent years, we've all seen a dramatic increase in the wildfires, their frequency, their size, their intensity. So it was no more obvious than this past summer when people literally in the corridor were asked to sequester themselves inside, despite the fact the fires were not here in the corridor particularly. The fact is, wildfires know no borders. And thus, if we are to be successful in addressing urban smoke and wildfires, we need to look at this as a borderless issue and all work together. And now we are reminded yet again in what's going on in California. So to develop the kind of solutions that we all need, we need to keep working together here in the Cascadia Corridor and on occasion well beyond, and sharing our work and our insights with everyone else. So today we will hear from a number of our experts on the subject. We're going to talk a little bit about what's the cause of this dramatic increase in fires, how is it impacting our particular mega region, and what we can do better to prevent and to manage them going forward. So now I'd like to turn the program over to our co-chair of our Higher Education Committee, Gail Murphy from the University of British Columbia. Gail?
Well, thank you, Governor Gregoire. It's really great to be here this morning. I'm really excited that the Higher Education Steering Committee piece can be bringing you this today, because today's event really does highlight that value of how we can come together to truly try and face and address the really daunting challenges that we have with climate change, growing populations, and how the impacts of wildfire and urban smoke that, as you said, have really been so evident in recent years, have really started to affect the Cascadia region. The origins of this forum really started back in 2016 when Microsoft helped bring together UBC and the University of Washington to really start addressing some of the large opportunities that we have to advance regional innovation through greater academic collaboration across that Canadian-US border. At that time, a research and student internship program was put together between UBC and UW that was funded by Microsoft to deal with urban data and looking at launching regionally focused projects that could take the advantages we have in our academic strength, our research strength, and really tie that to policy relevant topics like housing affordability, transportation access, drug addiction, and air quality. The partnership expanded extensively through the Cascadia Corridor conferences, and particularly in 2018, we had a large group come together to talk about how we could expand the initial collaboration to research universities throughout the region. Wildfire and smoke emerged from this group, both because of its importance and its impact, but also because it could really engage and leverage the diversity of research and expertise, not only in our research-focused land-grant universities, but also our city-oriented urban-serving universities and our city-based flagship universities. So it's truly a topic that can reach across the region and bring together people with very different perspectives. And we know that diversity really helps lead to innovation and great results. So over the past year and a half, over 100 researchers from universities, government agencies, companies, and not-for-profits have met regularly to study the problems associated with wildfire and urban smoke that could most benefit from region-wide collaboration. And you're going to be hearing about those collaborations today. I think what you'll find is not only a lot of depth of experience and insights into this topic, but also how the universities, partnerships with government and others within our region can not only solve some problems that we have locally, but we can help lead the world throughout Western Canada and the United States, and ultimately to other vulnerable populations throughout the world. So with that, I hope you enjoyed today's session, and I'll turn it over to John Fink, who's going to take it from here.
Thanks, Gail. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We're really pleased to have this opportunity to talk to all of you. We are a group, as Gail mentioned, of academics and government agency people and nonprofits that have come together over the last year and a half to look at questions of wildfire and urban smoke. And one of the things we wanted to do was to say, what can we do in this region that is different from the many other activities that are going on related to these very critical issues today? So over the last year or so, we tried to find some topics that were not fully subscribed already. And we came up with issues like, what are the effects of wildfire on municipal water supplies? Or what happens, what are the data management issues associated with doing modeling that tracks smoke as it goes across an international border? Or very importantly, what are the psychological effects of having longer and longer wildfire seasons, both on the urban residents who are affected by smoke and on the firefighters themselves? So our group is quite diverse in terms of its backgrounds and in terms of its workplaces. Most of us are in the Cascadia Corridor ourselves, but we've also brought in some experts from California and Arizona, the East Coast, and other countries to help us better grapple with what is emerging as a very complex series of issues. Much of what we've been dealing with is parallel to what we're all facing with COVID-19, where we have problems that came upon us based on some long-term issues, and there aren't any really easy solutions. So what we need to do is to look at the balance of the problems and the solutions and try to find some that are optimized. What we're going to talk about today, what the 8 speakers will talk about, is a range of topics associated with wildfires and urban smoke. And we'll try to raise some questions for you to think about. What we would like from you are some ideas on how do we balance these issues. There, again, many of them are related to climate change. And we know that climate change is a set of issues that have been growing for decades, if not centuries. And so the solutions are also going to take a long time, but we need to bring together all of our best thinkers to figure out how we're going to move forward. So what we'll do is, each of our speakers will present for about 5 minutes. To the speakers, I'll give you a warning when you have about a minute to go. And then we'll have some Q&A among the group, but then we would welcome your questions and answers, both, through the chat window, and we'll try to address those. Each of the speakers today has participated in a webinar series that we've had, and so we have a longer presentation by each of those available on YouTube, and we'll post the links to those on the Cascadia Corridor website. We also are planning to do follow-up activities with this group. Any of you who are interested in participating, we'd welcome you to join us, and you can contact me through Portland State University or contact the people at the Cascadia Corridor to get on our mailing list. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Hago with the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy is the largest conservation organization in the world, and they are dealing with a number of wildfire issues. Ryan has worked on these both in Oregon, where he's currently based, and in Washington State, where he was with Nature Conservancy for many years. Ryan, over to you.
Great. Thank you, John, and thanks everyone. And John, are the slides, am I showing off my desktop or are you?
Here they come.
Okay. Well, again, thanks everybody for joining today. It's great to see all of you here to talk about these critical topics. And let's see, do I just call out for you to advance the slide?
Yes, just say next.
Yeah, next slide, please. So as Governor Gregoire mentioned, when we think about Cascadia, for so many of us, what we think about are just the amazing diverse range of ecosystems that we are blessed with here. And, today we're going to talk about the fact that fire is an inevitable part of many of these ecosystems. And while fire may be inevitable, it's also the natural role of fire is very different across these range of ecosystems. Often when we think about fire, we're thinking about our dry forests in the interior, on the east side of the mountains, forests which were historically maintained by frequent low severity fire. That was part of what made these forests healthy and resilient. And while the rest of my talk is going to primarily focus on these dry, historically frequent fire forests, I want to recognize that fire played an important role, perhaps at, with different severities at different intervals, but in many of our ecosystems, ranging from shrub, steppe, and grasslands to our magnificent mixed conifer forests through the Cascades, even out to our wet coastal forests. And some of the speakers later in the series this morning will talk about some of these other forest types. Next slide. It's also, I'm sure, not surprising to everyone, again, as Governor Gregoire mentioned, we are experiencing a lot more fire these days, at least compared to the middle of the 20th century. And these fires are oftentimes having devastating consequences for our communities and for people. But again, when we're comparing, what is normal, the middle of the 20th century, when we were favored by, a cooler and wetter climate, we were using all this technology that just come home from World War II to actively suppress fires, and that was fairly successful for several decades. But that allowed fuels to build up at the same time in many of our dry forest ecosystems. As those fuels built up, our climate has shifted back to a warmer and drier phase, and we are seeing this tremendous increase in fire. And and while there are uncertainties related to the impacts of projected climate change, we know we are going to be continuing to see more and more fire in coming years. Next slide. However, interestingly, last year, a number of colleagues and I published a study where we wanted to look at, so just how do fires over the contemporary period, over the last 30 years, compared to what our forests, at least in the Northwest, are used to and adapted to. So we compared both the extent and severity of fires burning across the Pacific Northwest compared to what we call the natural or historic fire regimes of these forest ecosystems. Again, how much and how severe would those fires be burning? And while we found that from 1984 to 2017, over 4 million acres had burned in our forests across Oregon and Washington, which is a whole lot. That was an order of magnitude less. It was less than 11% of what we would have naturally expected to have burned over the same time frame within these forest ecosystems under a natural fire regime. And so while we're getting a lot of fire, shockingly, it just shows how much fire, used to be, or how much fire our forests are adapted to. When fires are burning today, however, we found that within our dry forests, there's much, the severity, the severity of these fires, how many trees they are killing, it's much higher than what our forests are adapted to, and we're not getting that frequent low severity fire, which our dry forests need to stay healthy and resilient. Next slide. And so this has led to, in recent years, just a tremendous shift in our understanding and management of our fire-dependent forests, our dry forests. Tools like controlled burning, mechanical thinning, even managed wildfire can be used to safely restore the natural role of fire to these forests and to promote the resilience of these ecosystems in the face of a warming and drying climate. Because again, we know that, there is no future in which we do not have fire in our forests across the Northwest, and so we need our forests to be ready. Next slide. And there are some really nice examples of success. One of these was in Central Oregon in 2017. The Millie Fire was burning outside of the town of Sisters, Oregon. Many of you might know that area. And that also has been a hub of learning and activity, again, on trying to restore our dry forest ecosystems. As that Millie wildfire burned in towards an area that had been treated prior to the wildfire in previous years, it didn't stop the wildfire, but it changed how it burning. It changed the intensity of that fire, allowed fire managers to sort of have a safe place to stage their equipment, stage their activities, and that wildfire, while it didn't necessarily go out, it burned in a way that was much healthier for the forests and presented much less risk to the community because of that treatment that had gone in ahead of time. Next slide.
1 minute.
Thank you. And so finally, we know that there's how much of this work do we need to do to return low severity fire to our forests? A series of studies that I've been fortunate to work with over the last several years show that nearly 33% of our interior forests across Oregon, Washington are in need of returning this disturbance to help promote the resilience of our dry forests. So there is a lot of work to do out there. And finally, last slide, or next slide. To get this work done, we need to work together. It is going to require efforts from the federal, state, and local levels. It's going to require the ability to bring our various interest groups and stakeholders who care about our forests to find a collaborative path forward. I put a screen grab up here from state of Washington's recent 20-year forest health strategic plan. A very nice example of how do we collaboratively work together to ensure resilient forests and healthy communities. So with that, next slide. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ryan. Nice overview. And we'll have opportunities for everybody to amplify these comments as we go forward. So the next speaker is Chris Bone, who is an associate professor of geography at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. And much of what you're going to hear today is coming from academics, but there's always the question of how do you take academic research and translate that into policy? And that's part of what Chris is going to talk with us about today.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here and the opportunity to speak. So my research is primarily focused on how climate change and land use policies and management influence large-scale forest disturbances. And my presentation today is going to look at wildfire through the lens of another disturbance with the objective of providing some guiding principles on how we can move forward when thinking about solutions. So the next slide, please. Prior to wildfires becoming the all-consuming topic of the day for many of us, the pine forests of Western North America, as well as a lot of the economies and the communities that rely upon them, were heavily impacted by this little bug on the left here, the mountain pine beetle, which essentially through the 90s and 2000s had a wide impact or a large-scale impact on the forests that many of us are very familiar with, as you can see on the picture on the right. Next slide, please. I'm going to run through a few slides pretty quickly here. So the graph on the top here shows, at least in the United States, what the sort of impact was in millions of hectares. And you can see this peak in the mid sort of 2000s, 2008, 2009. In Canada, it follows a very similar trajectory as this. But I want to draw your attention to the graph on the bottom, which is actually the number of citations that was produced over this time if we start looking at work on mountain pine beetle. And this is sort of a telling story here with this sort of kind of ramp up and thinking about the science that was produced and thinking about all the knowledge that we were able to generate through all of this research and all the millions of dollars that were spent on this research, but then sort of trying to understand, well, where has that gotten us? So what I want to talk about a little bit is just thinking about sort of this idea about the generation of science and how do we actually utilize it in useful ways? So next slide, please. What I want to do is kind of just turn our attention to we did a project for 5 years through 11 states in the Western US, looking at mountain pine beetle impacts. And here was one of our sites here in the Black Hills of South Dakota, where in the late 90s, when the outbreak took hold, science was put into action as researchers from the University of South Dakota worked alongside federal, state land managers to help devise plans for large-scale thinning in ways that would disrupt how pine beetle communicate with each other to inflict tree mortality. This image is continuously shown as one of success. We have Custer State Park on the left, where management and thinning, and you could argue science, was put into play, where you don't see a lot of the red trees indicating tree mortality. And on the right, a wilderness area, an untreated area that bore the brunt of this impact. This is a very sort of simple binary of management versus non-management. And there are many caveats to this story. But if we go to the next slide, what I want to point out is that there was a collaboration between organizations from multiple levels of municipal, state, federal level agencies, environmental organizations, and active timber industry and university researchers to actually think about how putting science into action. And the next slide is just a sort of kind of a, showing you that this was essentially a very effective network that was able to mobilize, generate and mobilize knowledge in a useful way to impact how we think about resilience to climate change effects. The next slide will just kind of show you, we had some other case study sites that we looked at across the West, and this success story did not translate everywhere. And the main reason being was because not only were these networks not able to form for different reasons, but the success stories that happened in the Black Hills weren't communicated, and they weren't even within a single agency such as the U.S. Forest Service. The sort of the science and the knowledge that was produced through the success of how they thought about land management wasn't something that was necessarily mobilized in a useful way to other sites. So as we move on to the next slide, what became really important through the findings of this study, looking at these multiple case studies, was that the success about thinking about whether it be wildfire, whether it be mountain pine beetle outbreaks, or any forest disturbance comes from this very much an integrated perspective of how we think about the science of natural systems and forest ecology and management, and thinking about the social systems, how they could utilize and mobilize that knowledge, but at the same time, how do these social systems work? How do we get government agencies to work at different levels and different scales? And how do we get knowledge from both sides of thinking about the sort of social systems around forests, the natural systems around forests, to integrate into a meaningful way? And my last slide here is just sort of some kind of recommendations thinking about how do we address this in a wildfire context? Well, we as researchers at universities, government agencies need to work with stakeholders, practitioners, community groups, industry, and thinking about in a sort of embracing a transdisciplinary science. Transdisciplinary being this sort of kind of buzzword that's really being pushed around a lot in academia these days. And this is sort of turning research on its head and thinking about how do we fundamentally bring in stakeholders and those people on the ground to think about how we generate research questions, identify research problems, work with researchers to guide how we actually come up with solutions to problems. We need an advancement of frameworks. So this idea about bringing together natural and social systems, we need a coherent, agreed upon framework to think about something like wildfire and urban smoke in the Cascadia region so that we can all understand how we all fit into this broader context. And none of this is useful unless we have a commitment to knowledge mobilization. And mobilizing knowledge is something that you could argue the history of academia is not been successful at this. And how do we think about going sort of beyond our conventional modes of publications to something that is a sort of more diverse outlet of thinking about putting our actual findings into action through these different collaborations that we have. And so this is sort of a kind of a broad level path forward, thinking about how all of us together in this initiative can work to really conceive how we can come up with solutions for our current wildfire problems. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Chris. So we've now heard from one academic and one nonprofit, and now we're going to turn to a government researcher. Werner Kurtz is with Natural Resources Canada and the Pacific Institute of Climate Solutions. And Werner is going to talk to us about some of the overlap of wildfire and climate change and the bioeconomy. Werner?
Thank you, John, and good morning. Thanks to the organizers for this opportunity. I want to speak about the wildfire contribution to carbon emissions. Next slide, please. The 2018 report, special report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has made it clear that if we want to keep global warming temperature increases to 1.5 or 2 degrees, we must simultaneously reduce fossil fuel emissions and increase land sinks in order to achieve net zero or net negative emissions that more and more governments are committing to. What that means is that the CO2 removals through human activities from the atmosphere must be greater than the emissions caused by humans. In other words, we cannot keep the warming below 2 degrees without an active role of land sector carbon sinks. The problem is that forests are increasingly affected by climate change. Next. And what we have seen is in British Columbia, the fires of 2017 and 2018 burned roughly 3 million acres per year, and the emissions, direct emissions from fires alone, were in the order of 200 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year. And to put that in comparison, that's 3 times the emissions from all other sectors in British Columbia combined. The 2020 fires in California, Oregon, Washington, and now Colorado are still burning, but already they have burned over 5 million acres in that one season alone. We do not know the emissions yet. Next slide, please. What is important is that we must understand that this is not a new normal. The current H-class structure, as we heard earlier, the fuel loads resulting from fire suppression and the projected impacts of climate change are such that what we are experiencing is not a new normal. In contrast, it is we're on a ramping up situation where fire risks and emissions are likely to further increase in the coming years, albeit with high interannual variability, as we have seen in British Columbia with very low fires in 19 and 20. And these increasing fires will continue to have adverse impacts on human health, communities, future timber supply, and climate change by providing feedback. So the question that we need to answer is, can we transition from the current condition to a more resilient forest sector that can also contribute a large land-based carbon sink? Next slide. We have initiated a new project to investigate climate change mitigation and adaptation solutions that identify and enhance the synergies between activities that are aimed at reducing emissions from wildfires and those that can strengthen BC's forest-based bioeconomy. This is a collaborative project between my team at the Canadian Forest Service, Paul Hesberg and his team in the U.S. Forest Service, Laurie Daniels and Dominique Rosser at UBC, and colleagues at Parks Canada and BC, the BC government, and this is all funded by the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. Next slide. The first question we're trying to answer is, what are the greenhouse gas emission costs of alternative strategies? So we have tools that are enabling us to estimate the greenhouse gas balance of British Columbia's forests at 1 hectare spatial resolution. We're going to use these models to then implement, in consultation with stakeholders, alternative fire risk reduction strategies for those regions where fires are a priority. And we will then quantify the greenhouse gas emissions associated with these alternative strategies, paying in particular attention to alternatives to burning, such as thinning and the use of wood products in bioeconomy and in long-lived wood products. And we will be using this tool to estimate sink changes due to increased hardwood use and other landscape design options that are available to us. Next slide, please. Carbon use is very important. Carbon storage and wood products is an important aspect of the carbon cycle, and the use of these products to displace emissions from concrete, steel, and other fossil fuels is a very important aspect in the quantification of the benefits of various treatments. Next slide. But the big challenge is the estimation of the outcomes, greenhouse gas emission benefits of the alternative strategies. The biggest scientific challenge that we face is that estimation of changes in burn area, emissions per hectare, and future fire responses to alternative strategies is very, very difficult. And the reason is that the recent extreme fire conditions are referred to as unprecedented. And that means we have very few data and models that are capable and to quantify the responses to these alternative treatments. Next. So the way forward is that decades of fire suppression and land management decisions have created unsustainable fuel loads and fire risks throughout the West. We have heard about that and we'll hear more about that. So finding a realistic and sustainable future path that satisfies the many competing interests, not only carbon, but jobs, conservation, human health, etc., in a financially viable way will be challenging. The question that we're trying to answer is, could combining forest and fire management and bioeconomy objectives not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase carbon sinks, while also achieving multiple co-benefits? And just to close the loop, net negative emissions cannot be reached without the land sector carbon sinks. Thank you very much. Next slide. I think my contact information is on the next slide. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Werner. So this was an opportunity to expand out from a more academic perspective to think about how do these issues impact the economy and how do we get input from other sectors to try to address these problems. The next presentation is by Michael Brower from the University of British Columbia, and Michael is going to talk about the effects of smoke, and this is something that has affected all of us in the Pacific Northwest over the last several years, and likely will do so even more in the future. Michael?
Thanks, John. So even though you heard the last speaker say this is not the new normal, I think from the smoke perspective and from the public health perspective, we should be prepared for what we've all been experiencing over the last several years, which is smoke events to be even more prominent in the future. And that's sort of the context in which I call it the new normal. And from the public health perspective, our challenge is really how do we actually adapt to this situation that we have all now likely experienced. So next slide, please. So we actually know quite a lot about the health impacts of wildfire smoke. And even though this isn't something that I actually planned on studying, it's something that we've had to deal with over the last 20 years or so, as we have seen increased fire events and increased smoke events in our region, as well as elsewhere in the world. We know quite well that these smoke events, when they occur, they have quite profound impacts on population health, both respiratory disease, especially affecting those with pre-existing conditions. And this can range from relatively mild impacts, such as just a cough or difficulty breathing, especially to those who have these pre-existing conditions, leading to increased hospitalizations and even death. Quite important in the context of COVID that we've also seen and we've known for quite a long time that exposure to wildfire smoke worsens respiratory infections, whether that's a bacterial pneumonia or whether that's a viral infection like COVID. We've known about this interaction, and quite early on in the pandemic, we were raising the alarm about this possibility of this interaction, and really important to have adequate controls and adequate preventive measures in place in the event of the kinds of smoke episodes that we did see this summer and are continuing to see in the region. We don't yet know the full impact of the relationship between smoke and COVID. That's something that we'll have to go back at and look at. But again, just raises the importance of smoke in the overall health context. We also know quite well now that there's impacts on cardiovascular disease, again, leading to things like heart attack, stroke, and death in some cases. And we're getting emerging evidence of sort of an expansion of health impacts, for example, affecting people with diabetes, affecting birth outcomes, low birth weight babies, preterm births for mothers who are pregnant during smoke episodes. What I never thought we would actually have to consider is that these sort of one-off episodes may become repeated events to the extent that our populations in this region would be experiencing smoke events year in, year out. And while we're not quite yet there in Cascadia, this is exactly what California is experiencing. There's really no year now in the past 10 years when California, somewhere in the state, has not had a severe smoke event, and we're increasingly seeing that in our region. So we're also, one of the things I'd like to point out in the context of collaboration is because of the healthcare system that we have in British Columbia, we're able to very actively monitor the impacts on health because we have centralized databases, and we can look at prescription use, we can look at outpatient visits, we can look at hospitalizations across the entire province. And we've now used that in really a real-time surveillance where we can look at smoke events and look at exactly what's happening on essentially a real-time basis to the healthcare system and the health of the population. Next slide, please. So as you've heard already, and I won't belabor the point, we know that climate change is increasing the wildfires. It has already over the last 30 or 40 years. Next slide, please. And we know that this is actually going to worsen into the future. So these fires are larger, they're more frequent, the fire season is larger, and this is something that we are going to be living with for the rest of our lives, if not our children's and grandchildren's lives as well. Next slide, please. And while we certainly need to work on sort of changing on forest management and trying to move from the left of this slide to the right-hand side where we have better management and reduced smoke episode. Next slide, please. Even if we can actually manage our region perfectly, which I think is quite a tall order, the fires and smoke are all around us. And as this last summer, many of the fires, for example, in British Columbia, we had a relatively light fire season, but we were impacted by fires in Washington State and Oregon and California. In past years, it's been the opposite. In our region, in some cases, we've even been impacted by smoke from fires burning in Siberia. Fires in northern Canada can routinely impact populations in the Midwest or even down eastern seaboard of the U.S. So it's not just what we do in our region from a smoke perspective, but actually what others do all around us as well. Next slide, please. So what this means is that even though we can manage fires and manage forests as best as we can, we're likely to be dealing with smoke on a long-term basis. The positive side is that I do believe we can adapt and we can respond to this threat in a way that minimizes impacts on population health. And we actually know how to do this. It's really all about preparation, pre-season preparation in the context of those people with these pre-existing diseases, having those diseases managed, having protocols in place from everything from sporting events, to what about schools, what about outdoor races, etc. Having those protocols in place in advance will allow us to minimize the impacts during these episodes should they occur. We also have a lot of tools that have been developed that need to be enhanced, forecasting tools, and how we use those forecasting tools to actually trigger action, communicate risk to the public. And then also implementing interventions, whether that's just communication about individuals reducing their physical activity, canceling or modifying outdoor events, or infrastructure changes. Many of our metropolitan areas are now implementing clean air shelters, a place where someone can go to get relief from the smoke and achieve clean air. Putting in also systems when people have the ability to do so in the home or in the workplace to filter air, and in the worst cases, using evacuation as sort of our last resort. But the bottom line is we actually know how to adapt. We know how to implement these things. It's really all about preparation. So next slide, please. And I believe this is the last one. So thinking towards the future, one of the areas where I think we can work on in terms of increased collaboration, both across sectors, but also across the region, is really towards sort of smarter prescribed burning. We know that prescribed burns are a way to actually manage some of the fuel loading issues, but these burns also create smoke. We have the framework now to do this in a way where we can actually look at risks and benefits of individual burn events, where they are, when they occur, and how do we actually manage numbers of these burns in the context of them producing smoke, but also reducing the potential for a more severe smoke event that is uncontrolled. As I mentioned, a big challenge we have is both understanding, responding to, and developing tools to deal with the risks of these repeated episodes. If this becomes an annual event, as we expect it will be, that the region will be experiencing smoke, how do we deal with this on a longer term basis? And again, it's really all about preparedness and communication. So moving from this as a one-off event that may or may not occur to really expecting that we will have smoke in our region and learning how to live with it. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And so we're halfway through our presentations, and I just want to take a moment to invite people to put some questions in the chat. I think all of the talks that we've heard so far raise some difficult policy issues that we all have to address. And I would ask those of you who are not academics, but are either in business world or in government and policy roles, to just think about how do we raise these challenging problems to the attention of you and to the populations that are in our region. There aren't necessarily easy solutions to any of these issues, and so we really want to use our best thinking on how we can raise these issues without turning people off, where they just say, that's too hard, I'm going to move on to something simpler. Werner, did you have a comment?
No, I was just turning off my chat. Sorry about that.
Oh, okay, great. So now we've got the second set of 4 talks, and the next one is by Brian Harvey, who is an assistant professor at University of Washington. And Brian is going to talk with us about the different types of fires we've been seeing in the Pacific Northwest, and in particular, what is the risk for those of us who live in Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver, and the urbanized portion of the region west of the Cascades.
Thanks, John, and thanks for the opportunity to chat with you all. I'm going to pick up where Ryan Haugo left off when he alluded to fires on different sides of the Cascades operating in slightly different ways here, and talk a little bit about fire on the west side where some of our larger population centers are. Next slide, please. Okay, so oftentimes when we think about the west side, on the wet side of the Cascade Mountain Range, we imagine in one of these majestic old growth forests here in a Douglas fir Western hemlock old growth forest that's several hundred years old here, with the majestic towering trees, enormous biomass. It's hard to imagine that these forests are fire prone and have much of a relationship with fire, certainly based on what we've seen in the recent history. Next slide, please. And if we look at a map, just using Washington as an example of fire activity in the last several decades, this is 1984 through 2017, when we have a good satellite record of fire activity, both area burned and number of fires. More than 6 million acres have burned in Washington over that time period, not all of it in forest, but still a pretty substantial number. And I often ask audiences, any guesses as to what percentage of that is on the west side of the Cascade Crest, with that dotted line going up and down the ridge of the Cascade Mountains here? And oftentimes, get guesses ranging from a few percentages to 10%. Well, it sort of feels like an infomercial hyperbole to say that it's actually less than 0.1% of fire activity over the last several decades up to this year has occurred on the west side of the Cascade Crest in the state of Washington. So again, very easy to get lulled into a sense of complacency that fire is not something that we need to really be that concerned about, and is more of a dry, frequent fire forest issue in a place like Washington. Next slide, please. However, we know from lots of historical records that fire certainly has played a role on the west side of the Cascades, and different role in different ecosystems. I'm going to focus mostly on the forest ecosystems that blanket the west slope of the Cascades. And that box right there that's highlighted in red gives you an idea of the different kind of time scale that fire operates in these forests. So whereas on the east side of the Cascades, we're talking about fires that burn every few years to decades, depending on where you are, we're talking about fires that return on the order of several centuries and sometimes millennia on the west side of the Cascades. And when they do, there is plenty of biomass to burn naturally, and these forests usually burn in pretty dramatic fashion from what we understand from the historical record on the west side of the Cascades. Next slide, please. And we saw that come back this year in a way that we know has was likely coming, and there's probably going to be more of this in the future. This picture on the left-hand side is during that first week in September, when just in the northern part of the Oregon Cascades and up into Washington, over 800 acres burned in a pretty short time period. And that's not including all of the additional fires you see in Southern Oregon and in California, where we do start to transition into a more dry and frequent fire regime. So if you notice, that has a very distinct signature of all of those smoke plumes blowing out towards the Pacific Ocean from east to west. And so I'll come back to that in a minute here. But clearly on the map on the right, we're starting to see some of those west side fires reemerge in the contemporary record right in front of our eyes. And these are obviously very challenging and catastrophic to deal with from a societal standpoint on the west side of the Cascades. Next slide, please. What's interesting is when we look back, even in the documentary record, where we've got some blobby perimeter maps of fires on the west side, we know that actually during that very same week that these fires happened in 2020, 118 years ago in 1902, the Yakult burn in Oregon and Washington burned about 500,000 acres in about the same amount of short time. In a 48-hour period, most of that area was burned. And there's been similar events throughout the record in the 1930s in Northern Oregon. We know that this is not necessarily something that is unprecedented on the west side of the Cascades, but is certainly happening in a different context now, with what we have in terms of how people are configured on the west side of the Cascades. And certainly as the climate continues to warm, this is going to be a new context for these fires to occur in. Next slide, please. So I'd like to share at least one of many examples of collaborative research that is going on, looking at trying to understand the nature of these fires on the west side of the Cascades. And this is a collaborative project between the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, and largely funded by them through the USGS, the U.S. Forest Service, also with support from them, and includes several of us at UW, the Climate Impacts Group, the Washington Department of Natural Resources, members of the Tulalip Tribe Natural Resources, and as well as the National Park Service, looking at how do we use the best scientific tools that we have today to understand particularly the climate and weather drivers. And as that picture shows on the left, one of the key ingredients for this is these east winds, not that unlike the Santa Ana winds that we know a lot about in California. But this is a similar phenomenon up here in terms of these really strongly wind-driven fire events. Also understanding the burn severity patterns themselves using field and satellite data, as that center picture shows here. So bringing to bear big data on some of these challenges, and then in the field, tracking post-fire forest ecosystem response in real time following these fires, recognizing that there hasn't been much of an opportunity to track that in recent history because of the lack of fire activity over the last several decades, at least on the west side of the Cascades. Next slide, please. And just to leave a closing thought here, it's important to recognize that it really is a different relationship with fire on the west side of the Cascades. Many of these old growth forests that we know and love were born of severe and large fires of yesteryear, but it's a really important and critical question of how will they bounce back from today's fires in a climate situation that may be qualitatively different from how their parent trees established in, as well as in a very different societal context than some of those past fires occurred in. And next, final slide, I think is just my contact information. Happy to chat with anybody who is interested in learning more.
Thank you, Brian. Really important set of issues for those of us who live where we do. I'll just mention my background is in geology. I work on volcanoes in the Pacific Northwest. And one of the issues that comes up there is that the volcanoes don't erupt that frequently, which means that society doesn't think about that normally as an urgent issue. So when an eruption like Mount St. Helens occurred in 1980, there was really nobody around who had experienced something similar. We're also aware that there's a similar case in terms of the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake that is, depending on the models, due or overdue. And the difference between what Brian is talking about and those geological cases is that those earthquakes and volcanoes are not directly affected by, or even indirectly affected by, climate change. But the phenomena and the repeat intervals that Brian's talking about here in these wet forests, the frequency could increase because of climate change. So it's a different kind of mega problem that we have to address. I just want to comment, I want to thank the people who are putting questions in, and we'll get to those. We'll probably keep our discussion short so that we can respond to those that are coming in from all of you. So our next speaker is Natasha Brzezinski. And Natasha is with the BC Wildfire Service. So they are the folks in British Columbia who are trying to manage the response to the fires. They also support research both on fires and on the health and safety of people who are fighting the fires. So Natasha, thank you for sharing that view with us.
Great, thanks, John. And before I get started, I just quickly wanted to say thank you for the opportunity. We're really happy to be taking part in this group, in this presentation today. And also to just quickly pick up on something that Brian said and hopefully provide a bit more context for British Columbia, for those folks south of the border. Similar to what Brian was saying about the return intervals in Washington, the Coastal Fire Center, which covers southern British Columbia and Vancouver Island, where I live, experienced its highest hectares burned to date in 2018, for the time we have records for anyways. So certainly in recent years, we've seen something that we haven't seen in our lifetimes here on the south coast of BC as well. Next slide, please, John. So I just wanted to give a bit of perspective of what role a wildfire management agency plays generally and in a group like this. So to give you a bit of context, it's been sort of over the last 10 years that we've evolved from a wildfire suppression agency to a wildfire management agency. As Ryan said at the beginning, we've been very good at suppressing fires, and it's only been fairly recently that we've really evolved to more of a management agency. And beyond that, the BC Wildfire Service is now really responsible for the 4 pillars of emergency management here in BC, right from prevention through to recovery. And even in our response capacity, we are now more than just wildfire response. We are moving to an all hazards response agency. That's still very much an evolving process, but for instance, in recent years, we've had more of a formalized and structured role in the flood and freshet response activities that happen often in the spring here in British Columbia. A little bit more context, we manage wildfires on Crown land and land outside of organized areas. And because in British Columbia, most of the land is Crown land, it's not privately owned, we are responsible for the vast majority of forested and wildland area here in BC. About 2,000 fires a year, 232 million acres. We do not fight structure fires. Our crews are not equipped nor trained to do so, and we do not actually implement the evacuation orders or alerts. I won't read our mandate word for word, but as you can see, some of the things we've been talking about earlier in this call are reflected in the British Columbia Wildfire Services mandate. Next slide, please, John. A little bit more about our organization. We have two headquarters, one in the interior of the province in Kamloops and one on Vancouver Island in Victoria. We're broken up further, the province is broken up further into 6 fire centers and 41 zones, which all have management going on at different levels between the zone and the center. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but as you can see, the dark black lines delineate the fire centers, and we only have 2 fire centers that cover the northern portion of our province because the population base is very low there. And then the other 4 fire centers are sort of packed into the southern half to third of the province where the majority of the population is, and certainly where there are fire-prone areas as well. I also wanted to mention that we have a variety of crews, both initial attack, 3-person crews, 20-person unit crews, para-attack crews who jump out of planes, RAP attack crews who rappel from helicopters, and we're able to get other support as needed through contract crews, out-of-province resources, and military, just to name a few. Next slide, please, John. I also wanted to touch on, I think it's relevant for this group, a bit of a coordination with the U.S. and also differences from the U.S. So we do have active cross-border coordination on fires that occur on and near the border with Washington State. So that's largely done through a agreement called Hands Across the Border. And that allows us to do a few things that just help ensure more effective management of fires that might cross borders. There's some pre-clearance things that happen with getting our crews through the border and getting our staff sort of back and forth. And we also, it's just a relationship that's set up with our U.S. counterparts, staff who work near the border in BC and are responsible for those zones will meet with their U.S. counterparts in the winter and talk about different protocols and things that they should have sort of pre-planned for actually when a fire may occur. And then beyond fires that occur just along the border, we also have agreements in place so that we can provide support generally to the U.S. and so that the U.S. can provide support to us. That's largely managed through the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Centre, although there are other mutual aid agreements in place. And through CIFC, we can make requests and receive requests for resources being sent back and forth across the border. A few differences perhaps from the US that some folks may be familiar with in the US. Here in BC, all of our aircraft are contracted. We do not own any of our aircraft. Our crews don't carry fire shelters, and we have very few federal firefighters. It's only through our federal park system, Parks Canada, that there are federal firefighters. And I would just wanted to mention as well, we've been lucky this year in BC, especially with COVID, to have had quite a quiet fire season, quite a below average fire season. And it's also allowed us to have the resources available to send personnel to Oregon and California. The last crews just got back and are completing quarantine, so it was great to be able to provide some support to the US this year. Next slide, please, John. And what I wanted to mention, a little bit different than some of the other topics that have been talked about, but my role in the BC Wildfire Service is as a research and innovation officer. So I help facilitate research projects our service has deemed a priority. Although we have many priorities, one of our top priorities in research is health of our firefighting crews. As we've heard in some of the other presentation, wildfire seasons are growing longer, and there is more, I think in recent years, a concern about the effect of wood smoke. I think historically, 20 years ago, crews thought, wood smoke's fine, but it's becoming obvious that it's not. Through one study we've done recently, it's becoming obvious that we need to do something for our crews along the lines of masks and/or respirators. They are being exposed certainly to something, a number of things to their respiratory system. And it's a challenge for us because there really isn't a mask or a respirator that we are aware of that is on the market or even in development that is appropriate for wildland firefighting. So I don't, obviously know who's in the audience, but the BC Wildfire Service would be interested in meeting folks that are working in this space and having some preliminary exploratory conversations. So maybe with that, I'll say thank you and turn it back over to John.
Thanks, Natasha. Very useful perspective. So next we're going to get an engineering perspective from Erica Fisher, who is a faculty member at Oregon State University. And many of the issues that have gotten in the news related to wildfire have been focused on the wildland-urban interface, where forests and urban areas or ex-urban areas are coming together. And this is one of the topics that Erica has worked on and can share with us today.
Thank you, John, and I'm excited to be here and talk to you all about this big problem that we have. So just to build off of what my fellow presenters have already said, Ryan started off saying we need our forests to be ready, but we also need our communities to be ready. So we need to start a new conversation that talks about civil infrastructure and the way that we can harden civil infrastructure, the way that we can dig into our urban planning techniques to protect our communities from damage to fires over and over again. And then also, Natasha brought up a really good point of that a lot of our firefighters are not trained both in fighting fire in the wilderness and fighting the fires in the communities, and vice versa. So our community firefighters are not trained in these wildland firefighter techniques. So, thinking about when our fires do encroach on our communities and start burning structures, working together across these disciplines to make sure that we can save our communities. So, next slide. So first, I do want to start off just saying, how are we actually calculating the risk to our communities in our wildland urban interface, or WUI? And that it really goes back to the National Fire Danger Rating System. But this system is focused just on vegetation. It really doesn't consider whether homes have been mitigated or defensible spaces put in place, or how many homes are using non-combustible materials, or just even any urban planning techniques. Next slide. And this is the result. This is the home that burned down in the Holiday Farm fire just recently in Oregon. And so we're not considering the mitigation techniques for homes, but we're also not considering that our homes are burning and our homes release a lot more energy, about 10 times more energy than the vegetation that's burning around them. So our homes are WUI communities are at risk, and we're not particularly able to quantify that risk right now. If you can go to the next slide. And then on top of it, we know that WUI is the fastest growing land use in the contiguous United States, with more and more people moving into these WUI communities even just today. We're seeing large outmigration from cities such as Seattle and Portland and all throughout California into these WUI communities. So for the business owners on the call, if your employees are in these WUI communities and being threatened by wildfire and need to evacuate, how does that impact your business? How does that impact the economy of the region? Next slide. So if we're going to talk about community resilience, this is the definition from the National Academy of Sciences. We need to make sure that we actually understand what organizations or infrastructure actually contributes to that resilience. Next slide. And that just really comes down to 4. So today we're going to focus on the water. Next slide. And the water can be damaged in 2 different ways. We can move forward. So we've seen water damage in the water source being contaminated, but then the water network itself, the actual infrastructure of the water network, can be damaged and cause contamination throughout the distribution system. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. Next slide. So how does that happen? You can just keep pressing until all the boxes come up. There's an increased water usage during a fire, and that creates decompression and vacuum in the water lines. But like I said before, our homes are fuel load. Our homes are going to heat up whatever is below the surface of the ground. It's an incredibly large fuel source. And again, if we start looking around our homes, we're going to see a lot of things that shouldn't be burning at all. And that all of that burning is releasing toxic chemicals into the air. So that vacuum or decompression is sucking in those toxic chemicals, and then our pipes are heating up and potentially releasing more toxic chemicals. You can keep pressing. Just keep going, yeah. So all of this is related to burn severity, okay? So our homes are burning. We're not actually quantifying how much is burning. We're not using the correct metrics to actually compare one town to another. How do we compare Paradise to Santa Rosa to Medford to Talent? We don't have the language to do that, and that's a lot of what we've been doing here at Oregon State. You can just press enter twice. So if we look at density of damaged homes, we look at how does that relate to the impact of our water quality. In Santa Rosa, we saw that within the water quality advisory area, that yellow outline, 97% of the structures were damaged. Within the town of Paradise, 90% of the structures were damaged. You can press again. And then most recently, we see the Alameda fire, which destroyed of the structures that we're looking at, 73% of the residential structures were impacted or damaged. So we're seeing a significant amount of our structures being damaged. It's causing damage to other municipalities and other utilities and infrastructure within our region. You can press enter again. All right, so we have to accept, like my coworkers have, my colleagues have said here, that wildfires are going to happen. It's going to encroach on our communities, but we also have an incredibly amount of people moving into these communities. So how are we actually quantifying risk? We need a new focus on our community preparedness and mitigation, and we need to work across our Cascadia corridor to look at scenario analysis of these cities and towns being affected to actually quantify what our social impacts would be, what our economic impacts would be, education and housing. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you.
Thanks, Erica. Very useful and sobering perspective. So our last presentation today is by Jessica Block, who is joining us from Southern California. And as she'll share with you, she is literally fighting fires on a daily basis now, especially with the recent expansion of fires in Southern California. And one of the reasons that we've included Jessica is that the group that she's a part of has come up with a really novel approach to measuring what's happening in active fires and then putting that information into models that are useful for firefighters to know where the fire is likely to go. And so part of our question for Jessica is, what would it take to take these new techniques that are being developed elsewhere and to import them into Cascadia? Thanks, Jessica.
Thanks so much, John. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, my name is Jessica Block. I'm the Associate Director for Operational Programs at the Wildfire Lab. The Wildfire Lab is a lab within the Supercomputer Center at UC San Diego. And our mission is to turn data into a utility for fire science. And ways that we do that in part include building workflows to integrate data and software and computing together. And then a component of that, which includes taking the fire science into the real world, is translating the scientific and data advancements that we do in these integrated workflows into practical use. This image here is a picture I took from aircraft on my way to the Woolsey fire. And I'll show you how we're embarking right now on taking real-time data and integrating them to models. Next slide, please. So our vision here is dynamic data-driven fire modeling. Classically, on these large wildfire incidents in the United States, It's not until a large incident management team is deployed that a fire behavior analyst is also deployed and runs predictive models for strategic awareness of where the fire is going to go within the next day. So it's a strategic daily assessment. What we've built in Wildfire is a workflow data system where we're automatically importing a series of weather forecasts, because there are now many from different research and federal groups. Real-time weather sensors, or near real-time weather sensors, which are now a really tremendous asset in the state of California, because the large utility companies have been installing weather stations in very dense distribution throughout the state of California. And those are key real-time features that we can then pull into fire prediction models once we know where the fire is. And typically when a fire begins, especially if the wind is blowing really hard, a responding agency wants to know exactly where it is and where it's going to be in the next 15 minutes. So we integrate a bunch of existing data that already exists through our federal data system, in part the land fire fuels from the Forest Service. And once we get perimeters, we can predict where it's going in much closer to real time. Next slide. So this is an example of the workflow that we're running. Last year, we were part of the pilot program called FIRIS, the Fire Integrated Real-Time Intelligence System. And we have just embarked on our second year this fall, and got our first Santa Ana winds yesterday. And so there were 2 fires in Orange County that burned yesterday, when we got a series of really good perimeters and predictions on those. So the key of the system is that we have dedicated aircraft that is available and orderable on the onset of a fire. So if we know that there's high potential based on the ignition location and the weather conditions, the aircraft can be ordered, and we get perimeters right away, and we push them back to incident command. And then that data also pushes back to an example in the lower right there is an Android tablet that the Corona Fire Service uses to run an application called ATAC that can take the data in real time for field crews. So people on the ground know exactly where it is and where it's going. So this program last year and this year is the first that I know of where not only is aircraft being launched to do situational awareness on the fires and assessment, but also in real time sending concrete data that can be used to measure what's going on with a fire and be used for decision making. Next slide, please. Here's just a couple of examples of how that turned out last year. The Tick Fire, this is north of Los Angeles in the Santa Clarita area. The other great example for this one is to show you how much data we're actually pulling in real time too. It's not just weather stations and forecasts, but in the slide, in the image on the upper left, there is you can see the view sheds of the web cameras that are now available, also installed by the utility companies, from a group called Alert Wildfire, who have presented to this group. They're a consortium of UCSD, University of Oregon, and University of Nevada, Reno. And they're just a really amazing asset to be actually tracking what's going on and looking for smoke plumes. So if you hear that there's a fire in an area, you can check to see the status of that fire, whether or not the smoke plume is bending down due to the wind, which you can see in the upper right. But in the image on the left, also, you can see the red squares, which is the GOES satellite detection, telling us that GOES is also seeing a hot spot on the ground. And then within those red squares are the perimeters that we got from aircraft. And then so we had really strong validation on the severity and location of that event, and we're able to be sending that to the ground. And as trucks were approaching that incident, they knew exactly what was happening, and were able to do much more effective evacuations because of it. Next slide, please. This is the Getty Fire, which started around 2 in the morning on the 28th last year. So I told John this was like a really bad week for me to give this presentation because this is like the week in Southern California, and this is validating that. But just to show you here that we had a series of parameters which are hard to see on the right-hand screen, but we ran models at each stage that we got parameters from aircraft, and then after the fact, I overlaid the first initial progression on one of the concluding parameters, and it did a really good job. And the value in this process now is not to show you how great the predictive modeling is, because we're using Farsight, which was developed out of the Missoula Fire Lab. It's that those models are not always effective, and the vegetation data that we're using for these predictive models are also not always perfect. And so one of the great advantages of this process is actually being able to validate how predictive models are going to be used. Well, how they're being used and how they're being developed. We all know that the Santa Ana winds, or these wind events and these weather patterns that are changing with respect to climate change, have not been well calibrated. And so as fire science is being advanced, they also need validation from real world events at high temporal resolution. And that's what we're hoping to provide. So we're doing, our work is also intended to bring this data together and be able to do a bunch of artificial intelligence integrated fire science to this process. We've actually recently just been granted an NSF grant for a program we're calling Wildfire Commons, which is to establish an open data system and collaborative environment for identifying needs within the fire service and the fire science community, so that artificial intelligence tools can be developed, so that algorithms and data can be shared to advance across these problems.
Jessica, I think we need to wrap it up.
Okay, great. So the concluding is that regional technology is now, we've got a bunch of real-time data, and regional technology is now at our fingertips to be used. And I would argue that this is the type of program that could be potentially deployed as a regular process within the West. And thanks to that, we'll also have a bunch of data to feed back to a bunch of the problems that have also just been presented prior to me during this conference. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much. And I think one of the things that Jessica's presentation highlights is the potential role of technology and technology companies.
Next slide. If you have 10 seconds for the next slide. We have a series of virtual reality environments also, where the image, especially on the upper left, is a CAL FIRE chief, and in the back, an air attack captain reviewing fire smoke plumes through animation of those web cameras from UC San Diego, and evaluating after the fact environmental process. And so we have an opportunity to leverage what I think, John, you were saying, is that tech companies in the region have a lot to offer with respect to data integration, data visualization, and understanding processes during and after the fact.
Right. Great. Well, we have about 12 minutes left, and we're going to go right to the questions that many of you have typed in the chat, and we'll try to get answers to those, to the ones that we don't get to, posted for you to look at. So one that I want to start with is from Phil North with the Tualatin tribe, and he basically is talking about the fact that prior to the 1790s or late 1700s, there were people in these regions who had different relationships with fire and with forest management, and there is a lot that we can learn from how they were able to maintain a balance that we seem to have lost since. So I would ask any of you who want to comment from your perspective on what we can learn from indigenous knowledge relative to the issues that we're all grappling with right now. Anybody want to jump in? I will mention I sent a separate note to Phil saying that we have wanted to have more tribal input and indigenous input into this group, and so I would welcome Phil or others to suggest people that could join this group and participate. And anybody in the audience who wants to comment is welcome as well.
Well, I'll definitely comment. This is Amy Bridge. I'm with MIG in Berkeley, California. And I have to admit, listening to this webinar today, you really have your act together in comparison to how things feel in California right now. Obviously, we're having a very rough time, but it seems like you've been able to get the players to the same table. I've been in conversations. I live in Sonoma County, so just to put things in context, I've been in conversations with folks in Sacramento today, as well as California Natural Resources. And I think the biggest challenge we have is coalescing all the information and resources into one place. We don't have a statewide strategic plan here in California for wildfire yet. And we're trying to pitch that to Governor Newsom right now. But I'm wondering if anybody has any kind of tips as far as how you got your act together, even to have this webinar today.
Well, I think we have some advantages in Cascadia relative to California in that Cascadia is a more homogeneous region than California is. California is so diverse, even just comparing Southern and Northern California in terms of interest. So you'd have to have a really huge table to get all the players together. Here, we know each other better, and the issues are common from Southern Oregon up into Northern British Columbia to some extent, but there's enough diversity to make it worthwhile to be studying. So happy to talk with you offline. A lot of the credit goes to Governor Gregoire and this whole Cascadia Innovation Corridor initiative, which is attempting to pull the region together as a coherent entity, which we don't have taxing authority, we don't have a governance structure for this region, so it's all voluntary. But I think what's happened with the speakers you heard today and the other 30 or so that we've had over the last year is that they see benefit from talking to each other, and so it's been mutually reinforcing. Anybody else?
I'd love to talk to you offline. Thank you.
That's fine. So Phil, I'd be happy to talk to you offline as well. There also was a question about technology and some of the opportunities that offers, and I think we've heard a few talks, Jessica's comments, and actually several of them. But I'd open it up to others of the presenters if you want to comment about what we might like to learn from or benefit from our tech companies, and what are some of the concerns that one might have about how tech companies deal with data and data management that we have to be aware of. Just shout out if you have a comment. Don't be shy.
This is Jessica. One of the great challenges that I'm seeing is that there's a lot of advancement, or a lot of companies, especially coming out of Silicon Valley, that are claiming to do a lot of AI that's beneficial, but they're also intending to market that and sell it to fire departments. And we often don't recognize how little funding most fire departments actually have. So that's one of the reasons why we're advocating for an open consortium of AI algorithms and tools, so that the process, especially because these are scientific processes, we really can't be depending on proprietary algorithms for saving lives and understanding how we're going to manage our environment. That said, tremendous advancement happens when private industry can bring forward innovation. So it's a really important thing to keep that conversation open and allow for that innovation and collaboration to occur.
Anybody else? Erica, you look poised.
Just to follow up on that, the fire departments, but also, if we want communities to use these kinds of tools to help with emergency management, disaster planning, I agree with what Jessica's saying. Having proprietary algorithms and not having people within the communities that can understand them, or are having very complex programs that they need to use, is not going to be helpful for any of them.
Great. I want to come back to an issue that was raised by several of the speakers about how we balance dealing with these issues versus some of the challenges. So we could make the forest healthier by doing controlled burns, but then that releases more smoke. We could Think about the carbon emission implications that Werner talked about, but those can be expensive, or they might cause jobs. And I think what Werner was trying to present is that there are some ways to optimize for these various pieces, but these are really complex problems. And I just want to throw it back to the speakers to see if you have some additional comments about how we as a region can try to grapple with these really challenging, complicated problems.
Yeah, this is Werner. I think fundamentally the challenge is that we need to sit back, look at what has gotten us to the place we're in, anticipate the future climate change impacts, and then ask ourselves, what could be the desired future condition of our forests, and how can we get there from here? And for me, when I spoke about this not being the new normal, what I wanted to say, what I tried to say, is that it's actually going to get worse. It's not a new normal. We didn't step from one state to another. What we're experiencing is a progressively worsening situation. So what we experienced this year could be worse in a future year, and perhaps even next year. I mean, 2017, we had 1.2 million hectares burned, and everybody said, well, yeah, that's a unique event. And then 2018, we had 1.3 million hectares burned in BC. So the key thing here is fire suppression should really be the last resort. We can use these big models and the tech companies and the cloud computing facilities that we now have to describe what future conditions in these landscapes could look like, and explore and quantify how we might go on a path that would reduce future wildfire emissions. And we need to have that discussion with all of society so that we can look at the different values. Because some people, want conservation, want to keep the forests out there as they are today. But that's exactly, not what they were, and two, not what they're going to be resilient to when we have future severe fires.
Very good point. Yes, some of our allies in environmental management issues may not have the right perspective in terms of getting to a long-term solution. And I think there's similar things related to smoke. Anybody else want to jump in on that one?
Hi, it's Natasha here.
Sure.
Perhaps an obvious point, but I think something that's really been coming to the forefront in BC, not only with the 2017 and 2018 fire seasons and with the after action review, but also with how our government has chosen to approach COVID, is that there's been a lot of emphasis here in BC on really having it be a whole of society approach. And, I think that's kind of the point of this group. It's not that, the BC Wildfire Service doesn't have a role to play in grappling with the issues we have of prescribed burning versus the bioeconomy. But I think the more, again, sounds like maybe an obvious answer, but I think sort of a whole of society approach is what's being emphasized in BC.
Great. I'm going to jump. Bill Tam, if you're out there, you had a comment?
Yes, I did. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for hosting and moderating such a great session today. I just want to make a couple of comments that tie the last two things and see if I could expand a little bit on the technology piece. So I'm one of the co-founders of the Digital Technology Supercluster in Canada, and one of the things that we've been trying to do is to bring together industry and researchers, post-secondary together to solve some of the big problems that we have with the baseline of bringing data sets together. And certainly to Werner's comment earlier, I think predictive models and those sorts of things have been quite pervasive in the projects that we've seen. And I know that there are companies working with the BC government, probably with your group, Natasha, that are doing some modeling using augmented and virtual reality. Companies like Lamazoo that are doing that. We've got a project in the Earth Data Store, which is led by a company called EarthCast, which is doing Earth observation specific to looking at predictions on wildfires. And I think these are just symbols of how I think tech companies can weigh in to help support some of the initiatives you have underway. And I think the data privacy pieces will sort themselves through naturally, because I think the residency of that data will still remain in the respective jurisdictions. Is actually the leverage of that information that's most important. And I think there are some tools that we'd be happy to help with. So thanks very much, Jonathan.
Thanks, Bill. It's great to see you. So I think we're running out of time here, and we wanted to give Greg Davignon an opportunity to wrap this up. But before we do, let me again encourage any of you in the audience who are interested in participating or following up with this to join us. We have weekly webinars on Wednesdays at 1 o'clock. sometimes at other times. We welcome you as either speakers or audience members, and we are looking for group activities like this that we can do in the future to highlight the expertise that we have throughout the region. And we're really eager to expand our club to include more. Thank you all again for your great presentations. Greg, over to you.
Well, Jonathan, thank you very much for helping host and facilitate this session today. It was fantastic. And really, I think, Amy, to your comment, it really speaks to the collaboration and the ethos around the Pacific Northwest, where we're coming together to try to solve the big problems, but also recognize that it's not just people, but it's land-based. So we want to create the most sustainable mega region in the world. And I think the opportunity up and down Cascadia is prolific. And at some point that includes California, I suspect, on a longer term basis. So I want to thank you, Jonathan, for bringing us together and the continued work and collaboration. You're building out the ecosystem of knowledge and technology and solutions. And also to Gail Murphy, my friend from UBC. Gail's been instrumental as a co-chair in this particular group around research and collaboration across the universities in the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia. And it's been so imperative around the work that we've done around building out the Cascadia Innovation Corridor. I was struck by Ryan's first slide, and well, these are serious challenges that are so complex, as Werner laid out. Just to bring some levity, I was interested to see that we had such wet and suppressed fire incidents through the 1960s and 1970s. So if you're a child like me of the 1970s, urban smoke really was related to Cheech and Chong, not about forest fires. And if you know Cheech and Chong, actually it's a Cascadia Innovation collaboration of Tommy Chong and Cheech Marin, who met in Vancouver, one from California and one from British Columbia. So I'll let the anecdote go, but in that context, there's such an opportunity, I think, for us going forward to collaborate. And I'll give you a good example where Governor Gregoire and I probably have been speaking weekly since COVID happened, and the sharing of knowledge and information, particularly Chris's leadership, around how we've been able to work together to, while we're seeing an upsurge in transmission today, really learn from one another and sharing data and best practices that have really kept the population safe and our economies open for the most part in the Pacific Northwest. And it's that spirit of collaboration. I remember a day on September 13th, and Chris and I speaking to one another at our cabin, and Seattle and Vancouver had the worst air quality in the world, followed by Portland, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, and then Delhi was a distant sixth, I think. So it really speaks to the reality that we're talking about today. I won't do justice to summing up the just amazing research and cooperation that's happening at the academic and technology and boots on the ground level. But really, my takeaway was there's such a huge opportunity around data aggregation, open sourcing, and continued research to think about what we know, but what we could predictively understand in terms of dealing with, as you said, Jonathan, the trade-offs and the balance between the challenges and the opportunities we have in front of us, whether they be economically, ecologically, or from a human population perspective. Second is just the collaboration that we're seeing today, and how do we facilitate more of that? And that's really at the center of the ethos of the Cascadia Innovation Corridor. How do we bring people together that have technology solutions, expertise, and capital to really solve some of the world's biggest problems and make us the most sustainable mega region in the world? And that then allows us into this conversation that we explored today around preparedness and looking at managing property and forest ecosystems to enable us to deal with the interface between a growing urban environment, Jessica, I think you spoke to and others did, as well as the rural environment. And that includes the knowledge and wisdom of indigenous populations, where we've seen in British Columbia in 2018, 2019, as Werner will know, just devastation of native communities and the infrastructure around those communities because of the rural remoteness of the circumstances they face. And then how do we manage our own personal health going forward, aside from COVID, around respiratory illness and some of the other challenges we're going to have, let alone the preservation of the beauty and the nature and the ecosystem, why so many people live in this area. And then lastly, to Bill's point, how do we actually combine our knowledge and apply technology and solutions and collaboration to both prevent and anticipate, but also to fight and optimize solutions for urban smoke and ultimately climate mitigation, which I don't want to leave because at the end of the day, it's literally the accelerant to this conversation going forward. And we are not going to be successful in getting to net zero or to managing 1.5 degrees unless we have nature-based solutions inclusive of carbon sequestration in our forest and our land base. And those are at risk, let alone the emissions that happen from forest fires. So just to recap, lots of challenges, lots of opportunity, but I have great faith in human ingenuity and collaboration at purpose, and I can see it here in spades. And I want to thank all of you for participating today. So lastly, just on that theme, many of you will be interested in this, that look at the land base and technology and how we move forward. On November 20th, we have our next Cascadia Innovation Corridor conversation around sustainable agriculture and agritech. So we're going to explore some of the opportunities to integrate technology into the agricultural industry, look at it through the lens of the impacts on supply chains of COVID. And again, the Cascadia Corridor is a huge agricultural corridor moving talent, technology, and foods to sustain us in a healthy way going forward. But we're going to look at how we reduce toxicity, how we deal with disease issues, increased yields, but also natural sequestration opportunities, verified quality in the food supply chain, and look at issues around how we address labor challenges, frankly, in rural, remote areas, and some of the challenges that we're seeing in harvest and other circumstances. So with that, we're going to have restaurateurs, we'll have farmers, we'll have researchers, technology companies, all looking at these through different lenses around, again, how do we create the quality and the sustenance of food that we need to sustain us going forward. So with that, I'll remit you to connectcascadia.com, which is our website that you can move through. And I know some of you have shared your contact information today. And so I encourage you to reach out to the presenters. And I want to thank all of them again, personally, Ryan and Chris and Werner and Michael and Brian and Natasha and Erica and Jessica. And of course, Gail and Jonathan and all of you for participating in a great conversation. And thanks to my partner in crime, Chris Gregoire, for leadership. And we'll look forward to seeing you on November 20th and continued good work.